There is a city that should not exist. It sits in the middle of a lagoon on the northern edge of the Adriatic Sea, built on wooden piles driven into mud and sand, a cluster of islands connected by bridges and separated by canals, with no agricultural land, no mineral resources, no river access to the interior, no natural harbor in the conventional sense, no walls, no position on any major land route. By every principle of medieval urban geography, Venice should be a fishing village at best, an irrelevance at worst. Instead, for 5 centuries, it was the most powerful trading state in the Western world, the city that controlled the commerce between Europe and the East, that built an empire of islands and ports stretching from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, that produced more wealth per square meter than any other place on earth, and that did it all through a combination of maritime genius, commercial innovation, diplomatic ruthlessness, and a system of government so sophisticated that political theorists were still studying it and arguing about it 3 centuries after it had ceased to exist. And at the heart of that system, at the mechanism that made Venice's commercial empire function, that organized its trade routes, that determined who got rich and who did not, that allocated the resources of the Republic among its citizens, was the galley auction, the muda, the system by which the Venetian state auctioned off the right to use its state-owned merchant galleys on its established trade routes to the highest bidder, and by which, in 1366, a group of Venetian senators discovered that the gap between public authority and private interest was wide enough to sail a galley through. This is the story of that discovery. It is the story of the world's first documented insider trading scandal. It is the story of how a city that prided itself on the incorruptibility of its institutions discovered that its institutions were corruptible after all, of how an anonymous letter to the Doge unraveled a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the Republic's government, and of what Venice did about it. Because what Venice did about it is, in many ways, the most interesting part of the story. But to tell that story properly, we need to understand Venice first. We need to understand how this impossible city came to exist, how it built its commercial empire, and how the galley system that was the engine of that empire actually worked. Because without that foundation, the scandal of 1366 is just a story about corrupt officials. With it, it is something much larger. A story about the tension between public good and private interest that is as alive today as it was in the 14th century, and that Venice, uniquely among medieval polities, understood with a clarity and a sophistication that makes it one of the most instructive case studies in the history of governance. Venice was founded, according to its own tradition, by refugees. When the Huns swept across northern Italy in the 5th century, destroying the Roman cities of the Veneto, Aquileia, Padua, Altino, the survivors fled to the islands of the lagoon, where horses could not follow, and where the shallow waters provided a natural defense that no land army could easily overcome. This foundation myth, the city born from catastrophe, built by people who had lost everything and had nothing left to protect but their lives, shaped Venetian identity in ways that persisted for 1,000 years. The Venetians understood themselves as people who had been thrown back on their own resources, who could not rely on fertile land or natural wealth or powerful neighbors, who had to think their way to survival. What they thought of in the centuries after the fall of Rome was trade. The lagoon gave them fish and salt. Salt, especially, which in the medieval world was not a seasoning but a necessity, the only reliable means of preserving food through the winter, as valuable by weight as silver in some markets. The Venetians traded salt. They traded it north into the Alpine passes, south along the Adriatic coast, east to the Byzantine Empire that had survived Rome's fall and still controlled the eastern Mediterranean. They built boats to carry it, and the boats got larger, and the routes got longer, and the goods they carried diversified. Spices from the east, silks from Constantinople, grain from the Black Sea, timber from the Dalmatian coast, slaves from every direction. By the 9th century, Venice had negotiated a remarkable treaty with the Byzantine emperor, trading privileges in Constantinople and throughout the Byzantine Empire in exchange for naval assistance. This was the foundation of everything. Access to Byzantine trade networks gave Venice access to the luxury goods of the East: pepper and cinnamon and nutmeg and ginger, silks and cotton and dyes, glassware and metalwork and manuscripts. The Venetians bought these things in Constantinople and sold them in the markets of northern Europe for prices that reflected the enormous markup that scarcity and distance imposed. The profit margins were extraordinary, and every florin of profit was reinvested in more ships, more routes, more capacity, more trade. By the 12th century, Venice had extracted from Byzantium the most favorable trading terms in the medieval world: lower customs duties than Byzantine merchants themselves paid in their own ports, guaranteed warehouse space in Constantinople, legal protections that put Venetian merchants almost beyond the reach of Byzantine law. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, which Venice had instrumentalized to devastating effect, redirecting a crusade that was supposed to go to Egypt toward Constantinople instead, resulting in the sack of the Byzantine capital and the establishment of a Latin empire, gave Venice territorial control over key ports and islands throughout the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. The Duchy of the Archipelago, the island of Crete, Corfu, Modon, Coron, a string of bases that gave Venetian galleys safe harbor, fresh water, supplies, and repair facilities at regular intervals along every major trade route. Venice had built, by the 13th century, something that had never existed before in the Western world: a systematic, state-organized, geographically coherent maritime commercial empire. Not an empire in the military sense. Venice rarely held significant territorial possessions on land, and its military ambitions were always subordinated to its commercial ones: an empire of routes and ports and relationships and contracts and the constant, reliable movement of goods across the sea. And the instrument of that empire was the galley. The Venetian merchant galley of the 13th and 14th centuries was a technological achievement of the first order. It was long and narrow, typically around 40 meters in length and 5 meters in beam, with a shallow draft that allowed it to navigate the relatively shallow waters of the Adriatic and the Aegean without difficulty. It was powered by oars, banks of oarsmen providing motive power that was independent of the wind, supplemented by lateen sails that could be raised when the wind was favorable. This combination gave the merchant galley something that pure sailing ships of the period lacked: reliability of schedule. A galley could make progress against contrary winds, could maintain a timetable regardless of weather conditions, could be counted on to depart and arrive on predictable dates. Predictability was commercially valuable beyond calculation. A merchant who knew that his goods would arrive in Alexandria in 6 weeks, rather than sometime between 4 and 12 weeks, could plan. He could commit to contracts, honor obligations, manage his cash flow, coordinate with partners at the other end. The reliable schedule of the galley convoy was not merely a convenience. It was a precondition for the kind of complex multi-party, multi-currency, multi-commodity trade that Venice had developed into an art form. The galleys were expensive. Building one cost the equivalent of a substantial fortune. Manning one, the oarsmen, the sailors, the officers, the soldiers who provided security against pirates, required a large and skilled labor force. Maintaining one, repairing the damage of storms and collisions and the constant wear of salt water on wood and rope and metal, required continuous expenditure. And the galleys were risky. Storms sank them. Pirates seized them. Political crises in foreign ports stranded them. Wars closed the routes they depended on. Venice solved the problem of galley ownership through a typically Venetian combination of public organization and private enterprise. The state owned the galleys. They were built in the arsenal, the great state shipyard that was, by the 14th century, the largest industrial complex in the world, employing thousands of workers in a production system of remarkable efficiency and standardization. The state maintained the galleys, kept them in repair, and organized them into convoys, the muda, that sailed on established routes on fixed schedules. But the state did not operate the galleys commercially. It auctioned off the right to use them. The system worked as follows. Each year, for each established trade route, the muda of Flanders, which ran from Venice to Southampton and Bruges, the muda of Romania, which ran into the Black Sea, the muda of Alexandria, which ran to Egypt, the muda of Beirut, which served the Levantine spice trade, and several others. The Venetian Senate held a public auction. Merchants bid for the right to load cargo onto the galleys of that year's convoy, or for the right to act as the patron, the commercial manager, of a galley, responsible for its trading operations and entitled to a share of its profits. The system was elegant in its design. The state provided the infrastructure, the ships, the convoy organization, the naval escort, the diplomatic protection of Venetian trading privileges in foreign ports, and recouped its costs through the auction revenues. The private merchants provided the commercial energy, the goods, the capital, the market knowledge, the relationships with suppliers and buyers, and took the profit that their superior knowledge and effort generated. Public infrastructure, private enterprise, the interests of both aligned through the mechanism of the auction. In theory. In practice, the system had a structural vulnerability that anyone who has thought carefully about financial markets will recognize immediately. The people who organized the auctions, the senators who set the routes, determined the convoy schedules, decided how many galleys would sail on each route and when, were the same people who were eligible to bid in the auctions. They were not neutral administrators managing a public process for the benefit of the Republic. They were interested parties, with their own commercial interests, their own investments, their own networks of business relationships. They sat in the Senate and voted on the routes. Then they went home and decided how much to bid. This is the fundamental conflict of interest that the scandal of 1366 would expose. And to understand how it worked in practice, we need to understand how information functioned in the medieval commercial world. In the 14th century, information about trade conditions was the most valuable commodity in the Venetian commercial system. The price of pepper in Alexandria, the availability of grain in the Black Sea ports, the political situation in Flanders, whether the Count was at war with England, whether the roads were open, whether the market at Bruges was functioning, the condition of the galley fleet, which ships were in good repair, which were undermanned, which routes were likely to be profitable, and which were likely to encounter difficulties. All of this information was commercially valuable, and none of it was publicly available in any systematic way. The senators knew things that ordinary merchants did not. They received reports from Venetian ambassadors and commercial agents in foreign ports. They discussed, in the Senate, the strategic condition of Venice's trade routes and the factors that were likely to affect their profitability in the coming year. They made decisions about convoy schedules, about the number of galleys assigned to each route, about diplomatic initiatives that might open or close particular markets that would directly affect the value of the auction lots. And then they bid in the auctions. The temptation was obvious. If you knew, before the auction, that the muda of Alexandria was going to be unusually profitable this year because of favorable political conditions in Egypt, conditions that had been discussed in a Senate session that you attended, but that had not yet been communicated to the wider merchant community. You could bid aggressively for places on those galleys, secure in the knowledge that your investment would pay off. If you knew that the muda of Flanders was going to face difficulties because of political unrest in the Low Countries, Again, information discussed in Senate sessions. You could avoid those galleys or sell your allocation to someone who did not have your inside information. This is insider trading. It is the use of material non-public information, information obtained through a position of public trust, to gain an unfair advantage in a market. It is a practice that modern financial regulators regard as one of the most serious forms of market manipulation, because it fundamentally undermines the integrity of the price mechanism that makes markets function. When prices in an auction reflect not just the honest assessment of all participants, but the secretly superior knowledge of some of them. The auction is no longer doing what it is supposed to do. It is not allocating resources to the most efficient users. It is allocating them to the best informed, which in a system corrupted by insider trading means allocating them to the most powerful. In 1366, someone in Venice decided that this had gone far enough. The identity of the person who wrote the anonymous letter to the Doge, the letter that triggered the investigation, the letter that named names and described specific transactions and provided enough detail to make prosecution possible, is not known. It has never been known. The letter itself does not survive in a form that would allow us to identify its author. What we know is what the Venetian government records tell us, that in 1366, the Council of Ten, the powerful executive committee of the Venetian state responsible for security and the prosecution of crimes against the Republic, received information from an anonymous source that a group of senators had been systematically exploiting their positions to profit from the galley auctions. The Council of Ten was, by 1366, the most feared institution in the Venetian state. It had been created in 1310 in response to a failed coup attempt by the nobleman Bagiamonte Tiepolo, who had tried to overthrow the Republican government and establish himself as a lord in the manner of the signori, who were seizing power in other Italian cities. The Ten had been given extraordinary powers to investigate and punish threats to the state, powers that included the ability to conduct secret investigations, use informants, extract confessions under torture, and impose penalties without the normal procedural protections of Venetian law. They were, in modern terms, a combination of intelligence agency, prosecutorial authority, and Supreme Court, operating in secret, with no effective check on their power except the requirement that decisions be made collectively by the full council rather than by any individual member. Over the course of the 14th century, they had gradually extended their remit from the prosecution of political conspiracies to the investigation of any crime that threatened the Republic's integrity, including, as of 1366, financial corruption by public officials. The investigation that followed the anonymous letter was conducted with the thoroughness that characterized everything the Ten did. The account books of the accused senators were examined. Witnesses were interviewed. The records of the galley auctions were compared with the Senate minutes to establish which senators had been present at which discussions of trade route conditions and had subsequently bid in auctions for those routes. The pattern that emerged was damning. Several senators had, over a period of years, systematically used their knowledge of Senate deliberations to front-run the galley auctions. They had done so not directly, not by bidding themselves in their own names, which would have been too obvious, but through intermediaries. They had used agents, relatives, business partners, trusted employees to place bids on their behalf, or to purchase shares in galley allocations after the auctions had been completed. The arrangement was sophisticated enough to maintain a degree of deniability. It was always possible to argue that a senator's brother-in-law had made an independent business decision to invest in a particular galley, with no instruction or communication from the senator himself. The Ten were not deceived by this. They understood the networks of family and business relationship that structured Venetian commercial life well enough to trace the connections between the senators and the apparently independent investors who had profited from the same inside information. The web was clear enough once you knew where to look. What happened next is one of the most instructive episodes in the entire history of financial regulation. The Council of Ten did not simply punish the guilty. They redesigned the system. This is the distinctively Venetian response to institutional failure, and it is what separates Venice from every other medieval polity in its approach to governance. When a Venetian institution failed, when corruption was discovered, when a structural flaw was exposed, when the gap between intention and reality became too large to ignore, the Venetian response was not simply to punish the offenders and hope for the best. It was to analyze the failure, identify the structural conditions that had made it possible, and change those conditions so that the same failure would be harder to replicate in the future. This approach to institutional design, the systematic identification and elimination of structural vulnerabilities through legal and procedural innovation, was the secret of Venice's extraordinary political longevity. The Venetian Republic lasted from its effective foundation in the 9th century to its conquest by Napoleon in 1797. Nearly 1,000 years of continuous republican government, in a world where the average lifespan of a medieval Italian city-state was measured in decades. It lasted not because the Venetians were more virtuous than other people, the scandal of 1366 proves they were not, but because they were more systematic in their response to their own failures. The specific reforms that followed the 1366 scandal addressed the structural conflict of interest at the heart of the galley auction system. Senators who had participated in deliberations about a specific trade route were prohibited from bidding in the auction for that route or from holding any financial interest in the galley allocations that resulted from it. The prohibition extended to close family members, sons, brothers, fathers-in-law, to prevent the use of intermediaries that had been the mechanism of the original fraud. Auction records were to be maintained in greater detail, with the identities of all bidders recorded and cross-referenced against the list of senators who had been present at relevant deliberations. The principle underlying these reforms is recognizable to any student of modern financial regulation. It is the principle of the Chinese wall, the separation between those who possess material non-public information and those who participate in the market affected by that information. Modern securities law in the United States and throughout the developed world is built on exactly this principle. The insider who possesses non-public information is prohibited from trading on it, required to disclose it, or required to abstain from the market until the information has been made public. The forms are different. The underlying logic is identical to what the Venetian Council of Ten worked out in the aftermath of 1366. But we should not be too quick to celebrate Venice's institutional virtue. The reforms of 1366 were real, and they were effective in the specific area they addressed. But they did not eliminate the fundamental tension between public authority and private interest that the scandal had exposed. They managed it, contained it, made it harder to exploit in the specific way it had been exploited. The tension itself remained because the tension was structural. It was built into the nature of a system in which the same class of men governed the state and dominated its commerce, in which political and economic power were held by the same hands, in which the line between public duty and private interest was always going to be contested. Venice managed this tension better than any other medieval state. It managed it through institutional design, through the multiplication of oversight bodies, through the systematic use of anonymous denunciations, the Bocce di Leone, the lion's mouth letter boxes that stood in public places throughout the city, where any citizen could deposit an accusation against any official, through the rotation of offices, through the prohibition on certain family relationships among office holders, through 100 procedural innovations designed to prevent any individual or family from accumulating unchecked power. But management is not elimination. The conflict of interest that the 1366 scandal exposed was not resolved by the reforms that followed it. It was compressed, constrained, forced into less obvious channels. Corruption in Venice after 1366 was harder, more expensive, more dangerous than it had been before. It was not impossible. This is perhaps the most honest and most useful lesson that the Venetian experience offers to anyone thinking about the governance of markets and the management of public institutions. The goal is not the elimination of the conflict of interest. That goal is utopian, unachievable in any human institution where the same people who make public decisions also have private interests that are affected by those decisions. The goal is the design of systems that make the exploitation of that conflict difficult, detectable, and costly. Systems that create enough friction, enough oversight, enough accountability, that the temptation to use public power for private gain is consistently outweighed by the risk of being caught. Venice came closer to achieving this goal than any other medieval state. It did so through a process of continuous institutional learning, discovering failures, analyzing them, redesigning the systems that had produced them, and then watching to see what new failures the redesigned systems would generate in their turn. It was not a perfect system. It was a learning system, and the difference matters enormously. Let us go back to the lagoon. Let us go back to the city on the water, to the senators in their black robes walking the marble floors of the ducal palace, to the galleys loading at the quays of the arsenal, to the anonymous letter that arrived on the Doge's desk in 1366 and set in motion the investigation that would change the rules of the game. Who wrote that letter? We cannot know, but we can speculate about the kind of person who would write it, who would take the risk, who would have the knowledge, who would have the motivation. The anonymous denunciation was a recognized and institutionalized part of the Venetian system. The Bosche di Leone, the stone lions' heads with open mouths set into the walls of public buildings, were specifically designed to receive written accusations, and the system was taken seriously enough that false accusations were themselves a crime. The Venetian state understood that anonymous denunciations were a necessary part of any serious anti-corruption system, because corruption in high places is rarely exposed by those with the power to expose it openly. The senator who knows that his colleagues are cheating cannot always say so in the Senate without destroying his own career and making himself vulnerable to retaliation. The merchant who has been disadvantaged by insider trading cannot necessarily prove it through open legal process. The anonymous letter, for all its moral ambiguity, was a practical tool for bringing information to the surface that would otherwise remain buried. The person who wrote the letter to the Doge in 1366 almost certainly had direct knowledge of what was happening. The level of detail in the accusation, the specific names, the specific routes, the specific mechanisms of the fraud, suggests someone who had either participated in the scheme and decided to betray it, or someone who had been close enough to the participants to observe it from the inside. A disgruntled business partner, perhaps. A junior participant who felt he had been given less than his share of the profits. A rival merchant who had been consistently outbid in the auctions by people whose bidding patterns made no sense unless they knew something he did not. A senator who disapproved of what his colleagues were doing but could not say so openly without political consequences. The motive does not ultimately matter. What matters is that the letter was written, that it was taken seriously, and that it set in motion a process that changed the rules under which Venetian commercial governance operated. Because this is how institutional reform actually happens, not through the visionary work of enlightened legislators who anticipate structural flaws before they manifest, not through the systematic application of abstract principles of good governance to the design of new institutions. It happens through failure. It happens when something goes wrong badly enough that the system is forced to confront what it has been ignoring, when the gap between the theory of the institution and the reality of its operation becomes too large to paper over. The Venetian galley auction scandal of 1366 was a failure. It was a failure of the Republic's governance, a corruption of the public process that was supposed to allocate the resources of the state on behalf of all its citizens. And it was, simultaneously, an opportunity. An opportunity to see, with unusual clarity, what was actually happening in the space between the public rules and the private behavior of the men who were supposed to follow them. Venice took that opportunity. It did not look away from what the investigation revealed. It did not protect its senators from the consequences of their actions, or minimize the significance of what had been discovered, or quietly resolve the matter without public acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. It prosecuted, it reformed, it changed the rules, and the galleys kept sailing. The Muda kept departing on their fixed schedules through the Adriatic and the Aegean to Alexandria and Constantinople and Flanders and the Black Sea. The arsenal kept building. The Senate kept deliberating. The Council of Ten kept watching. The city on the water kept doing what it had always done, adapting, learning, surviving. In a world of kings and emperors and feudal lords, where power was personal and arbitrary and justified by divine right or military force, Venice had built something genuinely different. A system of governance that treated power as a problem to be managed rather than a gift to be enjoyed, that designed its institutions around the assumption that the people running them were self-interested rather than virtuous, and that used procedure and oversight and accountability to make self-interest serve the public good more often than not. It was not a perfect system. The senators who cheated in 1366 prove it was not. But it was a system that could learn from its failures, that had mechanisms for detecting and correcting them, that treated corruption not as an aberration to be excused, but as a structural problem to be solved. In this, as in so many things, Venice was ahead of its time. The galleys are gone now. The arsenal is a museum. The ducal palace is full of tourists. The trade routes that made Venice the center of the world have been obsolete for 500 years, since the Portuguese found the sea route to India and the center of European commerce shifted to the Atlantic. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, handed his golden cap to his servant and wept as Napoleon's terms of surrender were read to the Great Council in 1797. The 1,000-year republic ended not with a battle, but with a vote. But the problems that Venice was grappling with in 1366, the conflict between public authority and private interest, the use of privileged information for private gain, the challenge of designing institutions that align the incentives of officials with the interests of the public they serve. These problems did not end with the Republic. They are the permanent problems of any system that asks human beings to exercise public power while retaining private interests. They are the problems that securities regulators and central bankers and anti-corruption prosecutors are still grappling with today, in forms that are technically different but structurally identical to what the Council of Ten confronted in the aftermath of an anonymous letter in 1366. The anonymous letter writer knew something important. They knew that the system was being gamed by the people who were supposed to run it. They knew that the public auction was not public in any meaningful sense if the people with the best information were the ones making the rules about who could bid. They knew that the gap between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law was being exploited by people who were sophisticated enough to stay within the letter while destroying the spirit. And they wrote it down. They put it in the lion's mouth. They trusted the system, or more precisely, they trusted a part of the system, the part that was separate from the part that was corrupted, to do something about it. The system did something about it. That is the story of Venice in 1366, a story of corruption discovered, prosecuted, and, partially, imperfectly, but genuinely, reformed. A story of a city that understood 700 years ago that the integrity of its markets was not a given but an achievement, not a natural condition but a constructed one, maintained by constant vigilance and the willingness to look honestly at failure when it occurred. The galley sails unfurl in the harbor. The oarsmen take their places. The convoy master gives the signal, and somewhere in the ducal palace, in the offices of the Council of Ten, someone is reading a letter. An anonymous letter. A letter that begins, "There is something you should know." There always is.